And
well, I know you.
I talked earlier about Cliff building a club there in Beaumont. Him and the doctor, a guy named Dr. Smith, financed the thing and built a nice club there called the Cliff Brewer Club on Fort Arthur Road. It's the first club that I ever saw that had a movable bandstand. It had rollers on it, and for weeknights or something they could move it and adjust it to the whole back end of the club would move with the bandstand. You could cut the club in half, in other words, or move it back. And Cliff played it nightly, of course, and his opening night out there, I was playing with, I guess with Moon, the night he opened. And he was so well known, so well liked over there that it was just like a business opening, which it was. I mean, the civic leaders was involved, and a lot of business places sent flowers and all this kind of stuff, you know, like a new business is welcome to this new club, this and that. So, at any rate, J.R. Chapwell shows up on the scene here. I'd gone down to Cliff's radio program the next day after Cliff had opened the club that night. And I heard a little bit, had a remote that night. I heard a little bit of it opening. Of course, the place is packed. Well, I get two stories. I go down to Cliff's program the next morning, and J.R. sitting there, Chatwell. And J.R. said, man, he said, I went out to Cliff's club opening last night and said, he ain't got no band. Well, he had a good band. I said, you hadn't? He said, no, he don't have a band, he's got a greeting band. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'll be up there trying to play loud harmony with him, and I'd look, and he'd be out on the floor hugging some shipyard worker's neck and leaving me up there playing. And he's shaking hands and greeting all night.
Greeting band.
Yeah, greeting band. And he took his Cliff's fiddle home with him. So then Cliff shows up, and then I hear Cliff's story. He's, man, here I am in my new club, packed. Mayor, the civic leaders, everybody welcoming, all this kind of stuff. And he said, who walks in the door with his fiddle but J.R.? And comes in there and plugs in with that loud harmony. Not only that, he took my fiddle home with him. So then in walks J.R. They both together now. And Cliff said, hey, Chatwell, he said, you got my fiddle. He said, well, you got mine. And Cliff, he decided Cliff's bridge needed to be cut down on it and took it home with him that night and cut the bridge down, and he cut it too low. He had a penny stuck up under there, see. And Cliff all upset because JR came out there. Anyway, Cliff kept the club for a while, and he played it nightly, and then he got to booking in others. Bob Wills played it, and Tommy Duncan played it with his band after he left Wills and so forth. So anyway, one night out there where Cliff got a big crowd, and he's playing, and back in those days we had, all we could do to amplify a fiddle was a little rubber amplified pickup, and you held them on your fiddle with a rubber band. You put them on the strings, put the rubber band, and you can slide the little pickup on there. So Cliff's playing this night, these guys told me, and that rubber band broke, and the pickup falls on the floor, of course, and it'll feed back. So Cliff didn't have another rubber band, so he goes in the men's restroom to the machine in the restroom, and he puts a quarter in it, and it gets him one out of that machine, a condom out of the machine, gets up on the bandstand, stretches and puts it around a small part of the fiddle, ties it in a knot, and puts that pickup up under there, and he's ready to play. And a little bit of bubble comes up on his fiddle. So other agents and stuff started contacting him about booking other bands in there. So Cliff's getting these calls from Nashville and different places of people was on the road. So he gets a call, and Hank Thompson, he thought. He booked Hank Thompson, was doing singles, and he's just getting started, but would get pretty well known. So Cliff's telling me this story himself. So he said, I'll book Hank Thompson in my club. So he said, I go down to Enterprise newspaper and I buy a big ad, 2 or 3 of them during the week. Hank Thompson's going to be at the Cliff Brewer Club on Saturday night. I plug it on my radio program. Well, he said that particular night when he's due to be there, he said, I was at the club. He said, the back door opens, so a real skinny fella walks in there with a guitar in his hands, and I looked at him, he said, who are you? And he said, I'm Hank Williams. He said, I've got my Hanks mixed up. Little did he know, until the next year, you know, he couldn't have got them all, but yeah. Advertised Hank Thompson and booked in Hank Williams.
Now, we was talking earlier about in Beaumont, when it was really going during the war, that Cliff and Moon was top dogs in that area.
Oh yeah.
Making a lot of money.
Yeah.
And it was them and then everybody else.
That's right.
As far as those guys.
That's about right. Yeah. Within 150 miles, I don't care who played Beaumont, and I've seen Harry James play there, and I've seen Bob Wills play there, and all the big bands booking the Pleasure Pier. You go where Cliff Bruner and Moon played, they wouldn't hurt. The place would still be full.
Now, I've heard, in fact, I heard it on tape from JR, but Chatwell actually started out playing piano.
Mm-hmm.
And his inspiration for fiddle was Cliff.
That's right.
That he heard Cliff.
Yeah.
And your inspiration was both Cliff and JR.
Yeah.
How did you meet JR?
Well, listening to him on a radio program in Bowen, he was playing McBride over here, and Dickie McBride in the Music Max, and it was on KTRH, 50,000 watt station, every day at about 4 o'clock. And if I could get out of school sitting up in Beaumont, I would listen to the radio program. And I'd never seen JR or met him, but he was a fiddle player and already had a reputation as being a good fiddle player. So when we moved over here in 45 with Chevy's band, well, that's about the first place I went, was KTRH to catch McBride.
Mm-hmm.
And JR and Dick Jones was playing fiddles. And that's the first time I ever saw him.
Mm-hmm.
And hadn't played with him. He didn't know I played or anything. And I come see the radio program. And the next time I went down up there, well, Jimmy Weibel was the guitar player.
Mm-hmm.
Had Mansell and Jimmy Weibel and Buck and all of them good players, you know. And JR, I knew lived out off of Jensen someplace, so me and Shang Kennedy, we lived in this little mega course playing with your daddy. And one day a horse come through there and a fella on it, and I didn't pay attention, and Shang said, that was J.R. Chatwell riding that horse. I said, no, sure was. Walked up there and looked, and there was a white horse tied to the little cafe in front where we lived. And JR come out there and got on this horse bareback, and he was riding this white horse. And I hollered at him. Well, he knew Chevy, of course, so he got off the horse and tied him up and come in and played fiddle a little bit. And that's the first time I was ever really around him.
Mm-hmm.
And he would ride that white horse to the job sometime, they said. He'd ride it down to the downtown Houston and put the horse in the parking lot. And then want a ticket, parking ticket, like there's a bunch of horses in there.
Yeah.
And they said he'd ride it out to Auto Tail and wore suits in those days, and if he'd come in, he'd ride it and have white hair all on the back of his suit. Ride a horse. If you know how far it is from Jensen Drive to the boat Martin McCarty. Can you imagine riding a horse at night? Bareback? Anyway, he had this horse, you know, and you get into Chatwell stores now about half to. And some of them I witnessed, and a lot of them was told to, you know. And they used to tell about JR, and he'd go into San Antonio, I guess it was, and he had a flat on his car or a blowout. And he jumped out of his car, and here's a car coming down Highway 90, I think it was, and he jumped right out in front of this guy, waving like that. And boy, that guy swerved to miss JR, run off the road, went down the ditch away, and finally got the car stopped to keep from turning over. JR sticks his head in the window and says, "Say, man, you got a jack?" Anyway, Red Greenhall used to go pick him up, you know, and play the program. He said they lived out off of Jensen. And they went by to get him one day, and JR gave his fiddle a bath. Put it in the sink with soap, and washed his fiddle and hung it out on the clothesline to dry. And while it was out there, JR's cat chewed the scroll off the fiddle, gnawed the scroll off. And if you see a picture of JR now, a lot of times you'll see a fiddle that just runs out there and stops. He had to take his knife and cut the scroll off to trim it up. And the 4 keys will be there, and it just stops. And Red said we named it Old Mubi. You know, that's a cow without any horns. And but if you see a picture of JR, that may be the one, and it won't have no scroll because the calf gnawed it off.
Now with JR, it was all about playing. All
about playing. If you didn't play something pretty good, he had no time for you. So it gets into the part of the Auto Tail Blue Room, which was out on McCarty Drive then, which was a terrible end of town, but a beautiful club. It was a real class place for a while. guy that owned it, M.J. Fletcher, he had a band, he'd have a band playing downstairs and then a band playing on the roof, and sometime it could have been Billy May. He booked orchestras in there, he booked that, and McBride and his band usually was a sit-down band. They played there all the time, or Dick Jones and his band. And the place was called the Blue Room, and behind it was some motel rooms, and the inside was neon, was really coming in then, and the inside of the club was blue. When you walked in, it was blue. And the bandstand was fine, and probably the best sounding PA set I ever heard in a club for then. It was way ahead, I don't know who got to design it, but you could actually come in there and not take your amp, and you could just plug in the floor. Like a snake today, we plug in. He had jacks in the floor, and you could just plug in right there, and it would come out the PA. He was really ahead on whoever developed that. At any rate, that's was a top-notch place for a while there till the area got so bad. But all up and down that road was bands. There were 1, 2, 3, 4-piece bands all around that Auditel Blue Room. But the top, anyway, he booked Les Paul in there, and Les Paul. This was before he got into the multi-track thing. He was known mostly playing with Bing Crosby and among musicians, a great guitar player. Well, Jimmy Weibel was still here then, and Jimmy was playing with Dickie McBride and J.R. So J.R. himself is telling me this story. I heard this story right out of his mouth. And he said, you know, they booked Les Paul in the Auditel Blue Room the other night. And I knew that. And he said, I went out there, and he said, before Les played a note, while he was tuning up, he said, I told him, Jimmy Weibel is the greatest guitar player in the world.
Walked up there and told him that.
Yeah, before we ever played a note. He said, but Les had never heard Jimmy play. And he said, damn, I never had heard Les play either. He said, man, he hooked up that night, and he said when he played, he said he plays like you hunt quail. Like you're supposed to hunt quail is the way he played. And I had to say, how would that be, J.R.? He said, well, if you go out hunting quail and you flush them up, you just don't go to shooting like that. You wait till they level off, and then you just pick them off. He said, that's the way Les done those notes. What a way to describe it. But to look a man in the face and pretty telling, you know, you're not the best. That's what more or less amounted to. You're not the best. Jimmy's the best. But by gosh, I hadn't heard Les play either, he said.
Well, what was the band that they hired J.R. and the first night he said
yeah, this was way after that. And